Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And we want to welcome back Matthew Hongoltz-Hetling. He's a freelance journalist specialized in narrative features and investigative reporting. He's been named a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, won a George Polk Award, and has been voted Journalist of the Year by the Maine Press Association, among numerous other honors. His work has appeared in Foreign Policy, USA Today, Popular Science, Atavist Magazine, Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, the Associated Press, and elsewhere. And his new book, available May 20th, is called The Ghost Lab: How Bigfoot Hunters, Mediums, and Alien Enthusiasts Are Wrecking Science. Matt, it's a pleasure to have you on, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you guys so much for having me back. I've been looking forward to talking to you guys again for quite a while. My bio, you seem to have omitted the sentence about, about my handsomeness.
Oh, well, you don't need that. Everybody can see it. You don't need to speak
well,
about
yeah,
it.
I'd rather
most
be said.
handsome.
I'd rather it be said. Most handsome. Yeah, there we go.
So, all right, as we usually begin, I'm going to begin with a quote from Matt's book. So, in his book, Matt wrote, "Do you believe in ghosts? I do occasionally. During my childhood in depressed New England mill town, I woke up one night to find a ghost at my bedside. It wasn't in my field of view, but I sensed its menacing presence between the foot of my bed and a low set of windows overlooking the garage. I called out to my family for help, my voice thin with fright. No response. I decided that I simply had to look at the ghost. When it came for me, as it seemed inevitable, how else would I know in which direction to recoil? But the instant I turned to confront the spirit, something had struck me in the head. It felt as if I'd been harpooned in the temple. A lion would have roared, but I'm a possum. I froze. The spirit, I thought, did not want me to move. And so I lay whimpering in the dark. As the minutes dragged by, my terror dulled into a resigned misery, and then a dejected boredom. Somehow I fell back asleep. By morning's light, I discovered that the cord of my bedside lamp had ridden up from its usual spot between mattress and headboard. As I turned to see the ghost, I chugged the cord, causing the lamp to fall down from the narrow shelf above my headboard and strike me on the head. In the span of hours, I had touched two worlds. In one, a ghost threw a lamp at my head. In the other, the lamp came down by virtue of the mundane weight of my mundane noggin. Perhaps you have spent time in both worlds as well. America certainly has. So before we even get into the story, Matt, I just want to, so how do you, I have to ask, so now in terms of your work as a journalist, as a science communicator, so how do you see this experience? Because what tends to happen is, and we certainly know people like this in our personal lives, where they have these early experiences that essentially do become a form of spiritualism or a spiritual philosophy. So for you, how do you now interpret or even have reinterpreted this ghost story from your childhood?
Yeah, and that was not sort of like the only experience that I had when I was a young teen in particular, and actually I guess a little earlier than that, sort of like maybe like 9, 8, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. I was just so into all things paranormal. I snapped up all the books that I could find about it. I was a big yard sale hound, and so anywhere I went to a yard sale, I'd be in their book box looking for Bigfoot stories, Loch Ness stories, alien stories, ghost stories. And sort of like that combined with maybe a lack of my future self's sort of like certainty about what is and what is not possible, um, influenced me to have a bunch of personal experiences. I remember, being home alone as like a latchkey kid and having to sort of like leave the house because I thought that there was a spirit in there. And it was too frightening for me to talk to that spirit in my home. So like I went out to like a sunny field and I sat in the grass in like an inner tube. So I sort of like had 360-degree views and then like tried to engage the spirit in a discussion because it felt safer out there. Um, but looking back now, I basically say, all right, I was reading a lot of ghost stories, and so I was seeing ghosts in places that they were not. Um, and my belief in those sorts of phenomena died really hard. It died just sort of like one belief at a time. Like it slowly became more and more obvious to me that if there was a Bigfoot out there, we would have found it. And that sort of like the arguments for how it could still be out there undetected were getting more far-fetched. And it just sort of like strained my credulity. And then then you think, all right, well, the Loch Ness monster, that goes by the wayside. And so over time, I sort of like developed a new appreciation for what the scientific establishment has identified. And I've come to accept that as sort of like my yardstick for reality,
Mm.
what science can document and what it can't. Um, that's what I say. That's how I live my life. Yet still, when I wake up in the middle of the night, and I hear a creak in my house, my first thought is not burglars. It's
Mm.
ghosts. I catch that glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. Um, and I think that there's something paranormal there. And then, my my more conscious thoughts sort of catch up with me. And then I don't believe that that is the case anymore. So the course of writing this book sort of like allowed me to revisit those former beliefs that I'd had, allowed me to sort of rethink what I would describe as sort of like the hardcore skepticism that I had come into the writing of the book with, and to look at other people who had had those same sorts of experiences but taken a different life path, and sort of like try to look at them with sort of fresh and unbiased eyes and understand what they were saying. And I basically came to understand that they were not crazy, that they weren't lying to me,
Mm.
that they didn't have like a big agenda. And so I came to like respect the people, if not necessarily the beliefs that shape their actions all the time.
No, of course. And there's a sense to that, right? I mean, even as a kid, when you were looking for, let's say, evidence of the paranormal, right? Of spirits, of ghosts. I mean, honestly, I mean, if you do have that initial core belief that that exists or can exist, then you're already almost tuning your mind essentially to look for evidence of that where it may not exist, but you're going to think, oh, okay, there was a sound there in the middle of the night. That must be a ghost, not a robber, like that sort of thing. And then try to find new pieces of evidence to support that existing belief. But that premise could just already be faulty in the first place at its root. And so when I think about other people who might have these kinds of beliefs. I mean, also, I want to be empathetic. I want to be open, right? I want to give some credence to their perspective, be kind, maybe, and see why do they believe what they believe. But at the same time, yeah, I also have I wouldn't say I feel no. I feel yeah. I could say I feel empathy if somebody had a wrong, let's say, core premise or belief, and then built a whole perspective on that. Because then I wouldn't necessarily call them crazy. I wouldn't say that they're completely wrong. I would just at least kind of understand where they're coming from, not necessarily demonize maybe that point of view they're taking and completely other them, and then cause a rift, and then kind of further. Enforce kind of like their belief, existing beliefs. They'll just say, no, he's trying to like make me sound like a crazy person. And all of these people, most people who don't believe this, they're wrong and I'm right. And it could further kind of push them to one side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it is sort of like about a baseline of respect. And it is sort of appreciating other people's worldviews and that they might be different from yours. Yeah, I suppose essentially I feel like they ought to be respected in the same way that there's someone who believes that they've been abducted by aliens, for example,
Mm.
ought to be thought of in the same bucket as somebody who believes in a major world religion. Those
True.
things are sort of like equally implausible from where I sit, right? The idea of a man in the sky controlling everything.
Mhm.
Um, but or a different cultural practice that we may not appreciate the rationale behind.
Mhm.
Um, I think my experience suggests that we're sort of hardwired to believe the supernatural. And
Mhm.
we believe in science sort of like despite that, not because we're hardwired to appreciate science. Science is sort of like the thing that allows us to overcome our base nature. And when people were out there expressing their base natures by you know uh wanting to believe and seeing evidence of things that may not actually be there, um it's hard to look down on someone for that, even though we can sort of gently bring our own views to the table and hope that they prevail.
Yeah.
Where do you guys believe in ghosts, by the way? I didn't think to ask you to.
Good
No.
thing.
You
No,
do?
but I guess when I was a kid, I was very afraid of the dark. I would think that there's something there. I used to share, I don't know, I've never revealed this on the podcast, but
Oh
whatever.
my
Anyway,
God. All
I've
right. No,
had,
this is
I used to share the same bedroom as my grandma as a kid. I never had my own room until a way later age. So she had one
And
of
this is
those,
your
yeah,
grandmother was alive.
she was alive. Yeah.
Okay, okay,
I
got it.
wasn't
At the
sure.
Go
time.
ahead,
I
go
wasn't
ahead.
She
sure.
wasn't the ghost. She was not the ghost. Yeah. So
Got
she
it,
was
got it.
alive at the time. But when we go to sleep at night, I had my own bed and she had a bed too. But she's an older woman, and so she had one of those kind of like medical beds. They kind of incline and decline, right? So she had it inclined. It's like for her back. Okay. Anyway, it's dark. I'm on a flat bed. So imagine I'm here, and to my right is her bed, which is on an incline, and like she's sleeping. But there's this dark, negative space in between the flatness of my bed and the tip top of
Hmm.
her incline bed. And then I always wondered, like, like I would look into that darkness at night and think something is going on there, or
Mhm.
you'd hear about monsters under the bed or whatever. And I don't know. I really bought into it for a very long time. But of course, you get older and those beliefs kind of dissolve. I can't really quite place when did it start to dissolve. I suppose maybe, of course, yeah, me learning about science, having, empirical data or some kind of proof of what I'm seeing rather than it being like necessarily in my head. Have other people seen these things before? And then you get that most people haven't. And I don't know, it started to dissolve. Yeah.
Yeah, man. Yeah, for me, it was
Yeah.
I would say pretty similar, but the thing was, for whatever reason, I mean, I'm assuming it's mostly genetic. So because I'm generally a high anxiety person, when I was a kid, I was terrified of supernatural shit, man. Like literally, where
Yeah.
I think from about the ages of, if I had to guess, probably like from the ages of like 5 to maybe even like 13, 14, 15, man, I actually couldn't sleep at night because I was so terrified and I was like haunted by something. So whether it was a ghost, some spirit, whatever it was, like I didn't exactly know what it was. And I was super into New Age philosophy. So for the longest time, I actually did believe in it. And then so when I was into New Age philosophy, I remember we were I could actually kind of tell you when I started questioning it. So I was actually in an ancient history class in college. And so we were learning about Epicurus. And Epicurus had the belief that essentially we're all atoms. And fundamentally, essentially, when you die, atoms disappear, right? So you kind of just disappear. And I remember I was so horrified by this perspective. I was like, holy shit, man. Like, if that's fucking true, there's really no point of anything. And I just fell into like really, really deep existential despair. And I remember thinking, like, yo, I have to actually prove that there's such a thing as a supernatural. Even if there aren't ghosts, even if there like aren't actual entities, or let's say, I don't know, the remnants of entities still left on this planet or whatever it is on this realm, I felt like there still had to be some spiritual sense. Like maybe somewhere on the other side, like this all had to continue. And somewhere down the line, man, I don't know what it is, but I just stopped caring. I what's so funny? When if you would have told me back then, like especially as a kid, but if you would have told me back then, like, hey, so at some point you're not actually going to care whether or not your soul is deleted or whether you exist in the world or whatever, I would have been like, there's no fucking way, because this to me was the most horrifying feeling in the world. And I don't know, man, whether it's exposure, whether it's the fact that like these beliefs became so untenable at a point because they really were. And we'll get into Val because I wanted to even talk about like her understanding of the soul and trying to lecture on it, which is literally fucking impossible. So the point is to say, like, at some point you kind of just realize like it's sort of reality hitting you in the face, and you realize like these beliefs are untenable. So I don't know what it was. I don't know exactly. Maybe it's just accepting that everything in life dies. But at some point down the line, like my fear of like death and of non-existence was essentially desensitized. So, but yeah, man. But for the longest time, I would say from childhood on, I really deeply believed in it. And yeah, man, my sleep has been affected. I mean, up until now, obviously. But my sleep for years was affected by it.
And I have to
Wow. Wow.
say one extra thing, actually. So, like people who do psychedelics, for example, they may say
Yeah.
they encounter spiritual entities or their perception was altered to some degree where they perceived something spiritual or
Yes.
God or a feeling of wholeness. Funny enough, that is one of the only openings. So here's the thing. I wouldn't say I think that I agree with that. I could agree with your perception being altered in such a way that you believe you're perceiving some kind of spiritual entity or God. But because that is a sort of a physical sort of a pathway that you can ingest something and then experience this thing that enough people had said the same thing about, that one I'm slightly open to saying there's something to that. I couldn't tell you what is there, but there's something interesting going on there, even if it may not actually be an entity or whatever that they believe that they're perceiving. So I don't know.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense to me. And and so I ask about ghosts, and you guys sort of say, like I did, I did early. I had these very vivid, I mean, look at this, how many years later you're still talking about it as if it happened yesterday.
Mhm.
Um, and but I grew out of it. But then, there are also these sorts of like you know, fuzzier areas that are maybe not so cut and dry. Do you believe in a higher power? Do you believe that your loved ones continue in some way after they're gone?
Mhm.
Do you believe in aliens are out there? And I think it's perfectly reasonable to think that there are aliens in our universe. And if you accept that basic premise, then it's hard to imagine why they're not here,
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
But because you know give or take a million years on civilization development, some of them are certainly far, 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 far more advanced than we are.
Mm.
And so, if they're a million years ahead of us technology wise, which is almost a certainty, given the billions of years that the universe has been around, then why aren't they here? And yeah, maybe they are. Like
Mm.
and uh, but I sort of fall down on the idea of like if they have come to Earth. Um, Certainly they're going to be slick enough to not be showing up in random people's bedrooms at 3 in the morning,
Yeah.
and
Mm.
then taking them aboard for medical experiments or whatever it is that are sort of like the common hallmarks of an alien experiment.
And like Dayton,
And so
Ohio, or wherever.
yeah,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think they're sort of like plausible in the abstract, but then when you actually get down to an alien encounter, I find that not my defensive skeptic shields come out, and I start to sort of attack that from every angle.
Man.
Yeah, and why is it always an anal probe? Right?
No, I don't think that
It's not
that's true.
always.
I don't think that that's
It's
true.
such a
To be
common.
fair to these people, I don't think that that's
I know.
true.
But so Neil deGrasse Tyson actually said something very interesting. He's like, hey, if we really did have aliens come to Earth, why, with so many people having smartphones, like most of the world now having it, why hasn't one been photographed, for instance? That would be decent evidence. And then as well, and then of course, you can go further than that and say, of course, it could be photoshopped and da 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 da, all of that.
Yes.
But yeah, so actually, I kind of wanted to pivot a little. Wanted to ask you about, so in the book, there are three core characters. There are more than these three characters, of course, but we have Andy, Mike, and Bo. Can you talk about who these characters are and what is KRI? What is the significance of KRI?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you're asking that, I'm just sort of realizing I don't know if we've told your audience the name of the book, or like what it is. So I'm gonna hold up a copy here. This is The Ghost Lab
Yeah.
by Matt Hongoltz-Hetling. That's me. And It's called How Bigfoot Hunters, Mediums, and Alien Enthusiasts Are Wrecking Science.
Hmm.
And it may be more on point to say that they are sort of like challenging or stirring up science, and our belief systems as a whole.
Mm.
But so yeah, so I basically tell the story about how a very interesting group of colorful characters get together in a small New Hampshire community underneath the um leadership of a man named Andy Kitt. Andy Kitt is sort of like, you know, scientifically minded person. You know, he's loud. He is not afraid to be offensive. You know, that thinks sort of like, you know, to not be offensive is to be inauthentic.
Mm.
And so he really is sort of like offensive to a fault. And he had a bunch of personal experiences and became convinced that there were ghosts out there, and decided to sort of apply his logical science minded brain
Mhm.
to finding evidence of that. So he took up this sort of noble quest to inject science into the field of ghost hunting and other paranormal pursuits. And they assembled, yeah, this sort of like Avengers team of paranormal folks, right? So Mike Stevens was a Bigfoot hunter who also happened to be an alien abductee.
Mhm.
Uh, Sort of like a dyed in the wool New Hampshire blue collar guy. Came from, you know, sort of like a little bit of a rocky background, and is out there just sort of like, you know, trying to get through life while also proving that
Mhm.
aliens are out there. Um, and then there was Isabel Wesby. Oh, she was a psychic medium. She was
Mm.
also
Wow.
sort of like, you know, typical workaday mom into yoga and coffee and uh, going through issues with her family life. And the three of them got together. That they were sort of like the core of the group, and they also picked up, you know, a paralegal who heard voices in her head, who wanted to get to the bottom of why she was hearing voices in her head. And Val, who was a an empath. You know, she could feel the feelings of other people and non-human entities.
Mhm.
So they all sort of come together in this noble shared quest that they're going to find science. And they spent, you know, 9 years or 10 years pursuing that goal. That is, so I sort of like track their narrative in the book over the course of that 9 or 10 years.
Mhm.
And then I'm also providing a lot of context that tells us why their quest in particular is important.
I love that. So I'm just going to kind of mention this as a somewhat of a corollary, I guess, because it's not exactly the same thing. But my question is going to be an offshoot of this. So a lot of times when we think about trauma, it's hard to know like why certain experiences cause what we call PTSD, and some people are not so in others. There's like this really famous story, which I can't tell you off the top of my head who told it, but it was a really great story. And so it was of two twins who were raised in the same environment, and so both of them actually turned out to be completely different people.
Mhm.
And so the author asks both of them the same question. They said, so the author says, like, well, why do you think you turned out this way, right? And both twins actually had the same answer. So the twin who had the, let's say, more well adjusted and well adapted life, so he essentially said something along the lines of, well, but like, how could it have been otherwise, right? And then the twin who was, I think he was like a drug addict, potentially an alcoholic, he might have been cycling in and out of jail. He said the exact same thing. He said, well, look at my life. How could it have been otherwise, right? So why I want to use that as the sort of core of my question is because I think a lot of listeners will hear this, right? And you'll see the juxtaposition of Matt. And okay, Matt had these ghostly experiences and he turned out one way. And then we have these other core characters and they turned out another way, right? So obviously, look, I know we're never going to have definitive answers on this, but since you were so immersed in this world and you were able to contrast it with your own life and your upbringing and your own trajectory, and, kind of like I said, like, kind of my mindset shifted. And at some point, I kind of just stopped caring. It sort of seemed like that's what happened to you. So, in your understanding of everything that sort of transpired, of your experiences with these folks, like, what is it that you think why is it that, we're so different? That on the one hand, you have people with these experiences, let's say maybe like you or me, and we're able to say, well, we're going to have this other perspective of it, right? And then you have these other people who kind of continue to double down and lean into it and think to themselves, there's no possible way that it could be anything but this.
Yeah, you know, that's a great question and a sort of fantastic framing of one of the sort of core tensions that I uncovered within the paranormal community and within America at large while researching the book. So essentially, you know, what we would say, you know, we non-believers would say uh, that we have found that science is the best way to explain the universe, and we're closing off our minds to any other possibilities, right?
Right.
Uh, those inside the community would say, we are open to the possibility of things that can't be explained. We've had personal experiences, and um, you know, the fault is in closing yourself off. It's not considering what to us seemed to be like the simplest explanation for these things. You know, this figurine jumped off the shelf. This happened in the book. A little raccoon, a heavy sort of
Mhm.
paperweight type ceramic raccoon fell off of a shelf, and I've seen video of it, and it's very compelling. And I am saying, okay, well, maybe there was a computer on the desk underneath that shelf, and maybe the computer had like a slight vibration that caused the figurine to sort of like walk forward slowly over a period of days or months, and then just coincidentally it happened to fall at that time.
Hmm.
And to me, that's like an explanation that I can live with. It's not wholly satisfactory, but maybe that seems to me something that could happen.
Hmm.
And Andy Kitt, who founded this group, the Kitt Research Initiative, would say to me, like, why are you bending over backwards to come up with an explanation that sort of like supports your biased premise that the laws of physics govern everything?
Hmm.
Obviously to me, uh, the much simpler explanation is we had a Ouija board out. We were talking to spirits, and that thing toppled over. Yeah, like why would you bend over backwards to come up with a more complicated answer than just a ghost knocked it off? So yeah, they see themselves as open-minded and clear thinking in a way that we are not, and we think of them in sort of like the opposite way. And I think the tension is that we want a scientific explanation for these things.
Hmm.
And within the paranormal community, a lot of people also want scientific explanations for those things. That was the whole rationale for the KRI.
Hmm.
And Andy really saw KRI as an organization that would sort of create a seal of approval that would mean that a wacky paranormal belief had passed sort of like a baseline examination. They wanted
Hmm.
to have standards, and he went at this science thing, very seriously, and came up with a lot of scientifically defensible protocols for how they were going to do like a ghost hunt, how they were going to approach the question of whether or not spirit orbs are real, and everything else. And he sort of set up the screen. So he prioritized the pursuit of science and knowledge and evidence. But within the group, tensions arose because it turned out that other members within the group, when push came to shove,
Hmm.
prioritized those individual experiences. And if you have those experiences, you have to sort of conclude that um, because those experiences say different things, your desire to be inclusive and accepting of all those experiences leads you to believe that our shared reality is not real. So in other words, the scientific minded prioritization supports this idea that you guys and I probably share, which is that if there's a fact, that fact is equally true for everybody,
Hmm.
Right.
regardless of our beliefs. If there is a table in front of us, we will say there is a table in front of us. The spiritual minded folks might say, when I look at that table, I see water. I don't think that that table is actually a table. I think that it's water being sort of like represented in a table like form. They'll have like a very different interpretation of reality. And because some of these ideas aren't consistent with each other or compatible with each other, they believe that there is no such thing as a shared reality. And that cuts at sort of like the real core of why these beliefs are incompatible with institutions that are supported by science-based beliefs, evidence-based policies and science and the institutions that prop them up, like government and college, and scientific research institutions, and everything else, those things rely on the idea of a shared reality. And so there's sort of like a zero-sum game for those who want to hold on to those beliefs, because they can't coexist with the idea that science is the best way to understand the universe.
Yeah, and I have to say this. So in terms of Occam's razor, that's actually a really poor use of it. So I'm just gonna, I have to say this. So, okay. So just for our audience, so Occam's razor is pretty much what Matt just said. The simplest explanation is usually the most likely, right? Or the one that's probably true. So that doesn't make any sense. So first of all, implied, unfortunately here is that even if you say something like, oh, well, we can just explain it as a ghost did it, implied is a whole new set of physics that you would have to explain. So fundamentally, that's not the simplest answer, because that particular answer has its connotations to it. So ultimately, now if you're saying it was a ghost, you're going to have to explain how does ghosts exist outside of the laws of physics. You're going to have to explain what metaphysics even is. You're going to have to explain how metaphysics interacts with physics, how shared whatever, if you want to call it that, but how these shared or conjoined realities, even though they're completely disparate, how they interact with one another. So one could argue, Matt, even though on the surface your explanation might have seemed like the more complicated one, because it was in line with everything that we've already established in science, it's actually the simpler one. Their explanation is deceptively simple. It ain't simple at all. There's so much that has to be explained with their explanation. So I just had to say that.
In regards to science, as a very well established institution, arguably not even a social institution, but it's definitely very well cemented, right? There's sort of an allegorical thing that happens in the book, if I remember correctly. There was this university, Macintosh University, that was shut down, and I felt like, while reading, that was sort of allegorical to kind of say, like, our institutions were not being, rather, how should I put this? That the institution that was in place kind of fell apart. Could be for a number of reasons, but I guess sort of where I'm going with this is, why do you think that the characters found it more desirable to not go with the established institution, which could provide them with answers, and kind of like an opiate, kind of seeking this other form of thinking away from the establishment? Yeah.
Yeah, I think if there were sort of like a détente offered, where leading research institutions said, we have ongoing paranormal studies, we're open to the possibility, and we're putting some money and some minds on this, then I think perhaps the concept of science would have credibility that doesn't threaten the self-identity of the folks in the paranormal community. But
Okay.
we don't have that. What we have is a sort of all or nothing approach from both the institutions and from the paranormal folks. So, what we have is a scientific establishment and a scientific class that says, we've already looked at paranormal stuff, and there's nothing to it. And yeah, sort of like end of conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And once you do that, then the only conclusion that I can have, if I have that personal experience, is either that A, the scientific institution is horrifically flawed in a way that it cannot detect a thing that I have detected, that all of my friends have detected. We've had shared experiences. We'll talk to you for hours about how it couldn't have been anything other than the paranormal entity.
Mhm.
We go online, we find a lot of reinforcement for those ideas. So 40+% of Americans believe in various different paranormal things. And in the supernatural as a whole, it's a majority of Americans. And if you lump in religion, it's a vast majority of Americans.
Mhm.
So science is either missing that, either has like a huge blind spot for some reason, or option B, it is missing those things because it is corrupt. And it has an agenda that is about hiding the truth rather than is about discovering the truth, right?
Mm,
And so you're sort of like forced to believe those things. Or you can say, I'm crazy. And that's not a very appealing option
yeah.
for your rank and file experiencer, right? So they're going to go with A or B. And that either A or B is an invalidation of the scientific process, right? It's saying like I'm not if I'm right and if I'm who I say I am, then science must be wrong.
Mm,
And once you believe that science is fundamentally wrong or corrupt, then maybe the value of a college education at Macintosh College, where you are going to learn all the stuff that the scientists say, maybe that becomes less valid. And maybe you start to think about the scientists who are telling you to, get your COVID vaccine. And you think,
mm,
oh, well, maybe they're hiding something. So
interesting.
it's sort of like a baseline that lends itself very well to what we think of as conspiracy theories. But what I tried to do in the book was to sort of like understand and a little, just go a step further. And what are these worldviews that are giving rise to those conspiracy theories? And how can they be accommodated in a way that is compatible with our institutional structures? Uh, our default has been to say, if you're a scientist, you could essentially shit on the paranormal,
Mm,
because if you give it the time of day, you're endorsing it, you're capitulating to those ideas, and you're sort of like hurting. You're legitimizing it.
yeah.
But what I argue in the book is that the alternative is that you're freezing everybody out of those scientific circles, and there's a lot of people that you're frozen out, and they are actually delegitimizing you. You're not legitimizing them; they are legitimizing you by
Mm.
having sort of like a continued buy-in and stakeholder interest in keeping society more or less as it is.
Yeah. And I would also argue, I mean, because this would also, I would think, need to be taken into account. So like for this is also just, kind of my personal experience. So for somebody like me, like, so obviously, on this show, we cover institutional biases, injustices. That is a big part of what we do, social injustice. But the thing is, I have to tell you, just from my own personal perspective in my own life, I was actually given pretty a decent and ample amount of opportunities, like to go to school. I had financial aid. I was accepted into college, which I obviously went to. So for me personally, I certainly can't argue that, oh, the society or the institution sort of shunned me, so this is why I was the way I was. Because like just trying to think back at my mindset in like let's say my teens and in my early 20s, I don't think that there's any sort of acceptance at that time that could have actually shifted my views. And I remember it early on in like philosophy classes where I did have a few outside of my mentor who actually did get to me. I had a few people who really try to like really kind of drill into my perspective, and it just kind of went nowhere. So because I would argue that at that point my narcissism was so high and I needed to be right so deeply, not even just about like, I mean, about everything, but also just especially about spirituality, that it just, I couldn't function in a world where there was no such thing as, let's say no afterlife, and there was no God even. And so fundamentally what I'm saying is that like for somebody like me, again, with high anxiety and a high degree of narcissism, so I needed that to be true so desperately that I don't think it matters what kind of scientific institutions existed around me. Fundamentally, at least at that point of my life, that there was nothing that was going to change for me. So I guess I wonder, Matt, like what sort of, how many, or what sort of, or what's the sort of subset of people that you would see that are kind of like this, right? Where, how much, I guess, would we, and maybe this is hard to quantify, but how much blame or responsibility will we assign or ascribe to like society at large, and how much would we ascribe to the particular people? So what is it that you saw from your, what is it that you saw from your research? So was it that you more so saw people who were kind of just like, kind of conned into it a little bit, sort of more so disenfranchised, dejected, or was there also a pretty strong subset of people who were a little bit more volatile, narcissistic, and it was kind of like, yeah, I don't really care what you try to do for me, fuck society, which is pretty much the mentality that I had. I was like, I'm gonna believe what I want to believe. I don't give a shit what you want for me or for me or whatever it was.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So there are definitely like some of those like bad actors in these communities. There are, um, because paranormal experts, self-appointed experts, have taken the role of crust holder, the trustworthy expert opinion and voice for a lot of people in this country, right? And so if I hear voices in my head, am I going to go tell my therapist? Am I going to go tell a psychologist or my doctor? Or am I going to go tell a psychic medium and listen to
Mm.
their advice? And they're going to give me a much different explanation. Or am I going to go to a ghost hunter and they're going to give me a different explanation? Um, and so when you go out and look at those sorts of differences, it becomes you're creating a landscape in which those bad actors can come up. You can have the fraudulent psychic who is there to sort of like tell you that you've been cursed and you need to pay him or her $12,000 to lift that curse. You also have people who, one of the stories that I tell in the book pretty graphically is the story of Seth Mazzaglia.
Yes.
He
Yep.
was sort of like, maladjusted theater geek, D&D nerd, with delusions of grandeur, who came to believe that some of his D&D characters were in fact entities from another sort of like universe of existence beyond the veil,
Mm.
and that they had the ability to take over his body over time. And he would do tarot card readings. He was socially functional,
Mhm.
um, and had sort of like a forceful personality.
Mhm.
And eventually, because of those beliefs, which were being sort of like reinforced and accepted by more benign people within the paranormal community, he had an opportunity to enter into sort of like a horrifically abusive relationship with his much younger girlfriend,
Mhm.
um, in which they lived a sort of shared fantasy that dictated a lot of terms that were very unfavorable to her
Mm.
and that were very favorable to him. One of which was that she was sort of responsible for sexually satisfying the entities that controlled him,
Mhm.
or else they might cause him to do violence. And uh, that sort of like dynamic culminated in her luring a girl over to have sex with her boyfriend, the girl refusing and being killed by him,
Yeah.
by Seth
Oh.
Mazzaglia. So really terrible story. And I think that there was an opportunity for him to do that because he had been sort of like in a world where he was free to talk about a lot of these sorts of dark forces in ways that weren't challenged, and
Mm.
red flags weren't raised because he had this whole sort of community in which he could operate. He doesn't represent most of the paranormal people. As soon as the news came out, everybody was shocked and
Mm.
horrified and full of disavowals. So some of these people are just bad apples, right? That's the answer. But then you also raise this other question of like, well, to what extent are institutions responsible? And I think institutions have a lot of responsibility. Um, we know that paranormal beliefs and supernatural beliefs tend to thrive when people are feeling like they're less in control of a situation, right? When there's a place that's rocked by political instability, supernatural beliefs go up because
Mm.
people don't know what's going to happen in their day-to-day lives. They don't know where their next paycheck is coming from, and
Mhm.
so they are um, looking for answers that will give them a sort of clear, reassuring, rock solid answer. And that's exactly the sort of answer that a paranormal expert will give you. It's a demon. It's a parasitic entity. It's this, it's that. There was a really fascinating anthropological study done in the early 1900s, where the scientists went out and sort of documented the traditional fishing ways of a village, like an island village in the South Pacific. And they did two sorts of fishing. The first was that they sort of put a poisoned root onto the end of a stick and suck it into a coral reef, and the fish would sort of flee out of the coral and blunder into the nets that they had over the
Mm.
coral. So it was like 100% effective, very safe and secure. always got the fish that they were looking for. No associated supernatural beliefs with that practice. Their other type of fishing was a much different situation. They would go out into the dangerous ocean,
Hmm.
out of sort of like the cove on which they did their coral reef fishing, out into the open sea, in these like rickety little boats hunting sharks. And their method of hunting was basically to like mimic the sound of fish jumping out of the water and landing back in the water. And when the shark came to investigate, they would bash them to death with essentially like a chunk of wood. So very, very risky, very frightening, very fraught, not a high degree of success. And in order to support their shark fishing, the whole village went through a series of extreme and bizarre behaviors that were meant to increase their chances of success in the shark hunting. So there were all sorts of taboos that they lived under. The women couldn't dress a certain way. Nobody could raise their voices. There was no singing. People couldn't cut their hair for like a month. You know, they would put up with these sorts of things in a preparatory way to get ready for this uncertain event. And I think that that same human nature we see in our lives today when we don't know what's happening. Let's say in our love lives, because say you're single and you're looking for love.
Mhm.
That's a very sort of like out of control feeling, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
I really want to be in a partnership. I don't have a partnership. I don't know what's going to happen. Different people are telling me different things. So you go to your fortune teller. You go to your psychic, you go to your medium, and they will give you sort of like the pat answer that you're looking for, and you'll take a lot of comfort from that. And there's even some good from that. Um, but yeah, so no, I think that when our institutions are as flawed as they are, that is a driver of supernatural beliefs. If our institutions did a better job of providing public services, uh, we would have less reason to turn elsewhere for our belief systems.
Well, so I have a follow-up question. Can I? Okay. So then I would ask, would you say that because science is now so kind of not as it was maybe, 100 years ago, but it's sort of so dispersed, and the fact that we have so much, let's say, continuity as one aspect of it, but then we have where contributions matter, where it's not so much about a single kind of lone genius. Would you say that, and maybe, because I'm thinking the answer is yes, but I wonder what your perspective is. Would you say that for the most part, like this is our, institutions, as flawed as they are, that they're more likely to root out charlatans because they're sort of more anti-charisma, in the sense that sort of charismatic leaders are sort of checked, and they're checked pretty well and pretty significantly. Whereas, let's say, in like I was saying before, like with me, so my kind of need to feel special, no matter what the institution was, it doesn't matter. That was always going to override however accepted I was, right? Because on the one hand, let's say the scientific community would have said to me, hypothetically, they would have said, well, you could be a part of us, but you're not going to really stand out in the way that you might want. Whereas I was thinking, well, no, I want to be special. I want to be a sort of leader and a thought leader or trendsetter or whatever, in some ways, and also, contrarian as well. So I wonder, would you say that at the very least, with all of their flaws, again, that our institutions, for the most part, they pretty much at the very least offer a way more significant check on something like this than as opposed to the supernatural world, or whatever you want to call it, paranormal research or whatnot. Because for the most part, not only do you have people who, and maybe this is kind of me answering my question, but not only do you have people who are sort of more likely to fall for it because their sort of critical thinking skills are already a little bit diminished, but on top of that, it sort of feeds that, meaning that in some ways, like people in that realm sort of search for that. They search for charismatic leaders, whereas opposed to, again, then, kind of your day to day, I think for the most part, maybe I would argue that universities are more sort of antithetical to it.
Yeah, no, I mean absolutely. Like that's part of the idea of like a shared reality versus a reality that can be multiple things at once that's driven by individual experience, right? So yeah, absolutely. Science as a whole is not going to be a fertile landscape for somebody like Seth Mazzaglia to nurture some really batshit crazy ideas
Hmm.
to prey on other people. But so that's good for the purity of science and for sort of like the stability of science. But you're also you put it in such an interesting way, this anti-charisma drive. uh, for a procession and a profession and a worldview that needs to have public support and buy-in, we've established a system that drums out all the people with charisma. How is that good, right? Uh,
Yeah.
so sort of like the very thing that makes science good also makes it a more difficult sell to the public. Even though what they're selling is a better product, um, you don't have, all your explanations are boring.
Yes.
Everything you do has been done by committee. You're
Mm.
talking about incremental change, and this really sort of came to the front in early discussions about climate change, right? For a long time, we in the media were saying we got to cover both sides of this issue, whether or not climate change is real, right?
Mhm, mhm.
And
Mhm.
we would talk to a scientist, and then we would talk to somebody on the outside who was a denialist,
Yeah.
and the denialist sounded better. And
Yeah.
we'd give equal space in the newspaper, and the public would read it and say, like, okay, well, this one guy is saying it's absolute nonsense, and then you have this scientist who says, I'm not quite sure what, because they've put in so many hedges and uh qualifiers that it sounds like cold oatmeal, right? And so I
Mhm.
don't want to eat that. I'm going to eat this nice red steak that this other guy's cooking up for me. And so uh yeah, it is a fundamentally better landscape in terms of understanding the universe and building science and medical science and advances that we can all um believe in with a clear conscience. But it's also sort of like an Achilles heel that is, I think, coming back to bite science. Look at all the defunding happening right now. That is a manifestation, that of the idea that scientific research is not valuable, and it's not
Right.
valuable because of the conspiracy theories that take root in these broader, more innocuous communities
Mhm.
where paranormal belief systems are the norm.
Wow.
You know, it's insane. It's interesting. Like the very fact that sometimes an alternative sort of point of view that is not at all the norm, the fact that it could sound so interesting and appealing. Sometimes, like for example, you mentioned an example of a single guy looking for a girlfriend goes to a fortune teller, right? Okay. I mean, arguably, that could be more interesting of a way to, I guess explore that issue versus a therapist.
Alan's fortune teller agrees with him.
No, of course. No, no. But it is interesting because where I'm sort of going with this is for example, okay, like, or I'm building to this point still, but say like somebody turns on the light switch and another person turns on the same light switch. One person says, well, they have an explanation for why the light came on, electrical circuits, positive, negative charges, da 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 da, all of that. And then the other person says, no, the God of light made it, made the light appear in the room. Praise God, and then they get so, there's like a different kind of fantastical sort
It
of a
feels
sense,
magical.
yeah, to that reality. That's also why like things like I guess the law of attraction, for example, like people who bought into that like very hardcore when that was like a book, right? Or a set of books rather. I could kind of see the appeal, right? I mean, hey, there's this thought. If you believe this, it's going to happen. In fact, and this is kind of where I'm about to go with this. You know how you mentioned earlier, like, for example, the shared, like, for example, someone may say, for example, you're looking at a table, the other person's looking at that table who's more spiritually inclined and sees kind of water in front of them or something like that. I want to take that another step. Imagine they see the table with you and they convince you that they have a pretty well established shared sense of reality with you for other things that you can agree upon. But then they introduce these other ideas after introducing that they agree with you on other, common sense of ideas. And then you start to kind of buy into it a little bit because they're like, well, this is true. This is true. This is true for them as well. But all of a sudden, here's this like really wacky, fantastic, belief that, I find so appealing right now. And I guess I want to ask, like, we sort of answered this, right? That the institution's kind of, because there's an explanation for it, it becomes, I guess, boring,
Yes, sir.
right?
Sure.
But do you think we have some kind of a like an itch we need to scratch in ourselves that kind of like calls on like these sort of,
Yeah,
fantastical,
to go above the ordinary.
yeah,
Mhm.
like what do you think is going on there, I guess? Yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely think that that is a part of human nature. That like something in us craves that supernatural experience, and they're very, very seductive. A lot of
Hmm.
these arguments, and they're also they play very much to our ego.
Yeah.
Because when we've touched the supernatural, we become more special,
Hmm.
right? Yeah,
Right.
we are sort of like the gateway of that belief system, or of that belief that you've just touched upon. And so one of the institutions that I write about in the book that's also in trouble is the church, right? And I have
Hmm.
been, very critical of the church and of religious thinking over the course of my career. But um, one thing that churches do is that they bind communities together.
Mm.
Uh, their belief system is different from science. It's largely incompatible with science, but
Hmm.
it is shared, right? They believe they have a common dogma that explains the universe to them. And in that way, it's very, very different from the paranormal folks because the church has a gatekeeper. The church has your priest at the top, and you keep going up and you get to the Pope, and the
Hmm.
Pope will tell you what's up, right? You don't, you're just a believer, you're just a lay worshiper. You don't have any special uh power in
Mm.
in that dynamic.
Hmm.
You don't hold any cards in that power structure. You're almost by nature subservient to the church. Um, Ross Douthat, the conservative and religious minded New York Times columnist, uh, he says that individualism, is going to be the new religion.
Mm.
And he specifically said that like these new age beliefs are sort of like fusing into a religion of their own. But
Hmm.
he's also said just sort of like this idea of like celebration of the individual. It's eating everything. And supernatural beliefs play into that because I think you're right that there is a desire in all of us to feel special in that way. And it also sort of like fragments all of us into sort of ever more discrete chunks of belief.
Hmm. Wow. And then, so yeah, and then I would say this is probably naturally where this conversation is going. So now that we talked about like kind of the differences between these sort of beliefs and science or scientific validation, so I think the question definitely on my mind, I'm sure from our audience too, is so what happens when, so getting into now, going back to the story, right? So what happens when a lot of these, let's say, perspectives, expectations, predictions, what happens when they're invalidated, right? So how do these people confront the fact that, let's say, I don't know, if I predicted I'm going to discover such and such a body or this other thing at this other place, right? What happens when that doesn't happen? How does the framing there work?
Well, it takes a little doing. It takes a little doing. Um, you ask me the hard questions. Is that because I'm so handsome?
Yes.
I knew it.
Yeah.
I knew it. No. So there is built into the belief system sort of like explanations for why that evidence can't be produced. One of them we've already talked about. It's because science is flawed. But why can't I get my hands on some ectoplasm
Mm.
and put it in a jar and bring it to my local laboratory and ask them for an analysis?
Hmm.
And there is sort of like an idea that whatever is out there in this sort of paranormal realm is has a vested interest in not being proven,
Mm.
right? One of the things that I talk about in the book is the idea of CE5, close
Hmm.
encounters of the fifth kind. This is communicating with an alien spaceship or with aliens and having a back and forth exchange while you're on the ground and the spaceship is up in the sky,
Mm.
right? And so uh, some of the members of KRI sort of did some experiments in this regard, and they wound up on a mountaintop talking to a spaceship. that they saw up in the sky, some lights. And the spaceship seemed to respond to their mental directives, to their sort of like psychic communications. And the interaction was being mediated by some of the psychics' long established spirit guides. So they would talk to the spirit guides. The spirit guides would bring them back a message from the aliens. And the last thing that the aliens told them was that this was purely to give them themselves a token of belief that it was not going to be proof, that they were specifically withholding proof that would allow them to walk into the scientific lab and slam down a chunk of metal and say, look, this is from Mars, you know. That they and so there's an idea that whatever is out there is sort of like parceling the information out to us. And that is also reinforcing to the ego, because then you think, boy, you know, the ghost wanted me to have this experience. I've been chosen. Isn't that lovely?
Yeah. So it's pretty much going back to Karl Popper, right? So if, the idea is that we're essentially that science is a way of falsifying beliefs, where he would have argued that, you know, fundamentally beliefs that aren't testable are garbage already. But if science is a way of falsifying beliefs, this is completely antithetical to that. This is completely the opposite. So fundamentally, here is the experience is above all else. No matter what the evidence is, they will find a way to contort it to whatever the experience in the initial core beliefs are.
Yeah, you know, science has a lot of cultural cachet. So if they can find a way to say that science supports what their experience is, they will take that. That is a nice that plays to their ego. That is more affirming than the opposite. But if they believe that that science is not going to be compatible with those experiences, then yeah, absolutely. If there is that conflict, they're going to prioritize the belief system. But notably, that is not necessarily how Andy Kitt operated. Andy Kitt was trying very, very hard to maintain some sort of scientific objectivity and reality and bring that, because he believed that the two things were could be reconciled.
Right. And what was that like for him then? Because obviously, you know, over and over again, he kept coming up against the fact that it just wasn't happening. So for whatever reason, he just wasn't able to prove his hypothesis. So what was that like for him?
Yeah, he had some of what he would consider to be successes. He sort of like defined terms to his satisfaction. He developed some protocols for ghost hunting that were done to his satisfaction, and he collected what he considered to be evidence. The video of the raccoon jumping off the shelf being a case in point. Uh, and really, like, there's sort of like, it's almost more like a field biologist who goes out into the wild to document maybe a phenomenon that's not been observed yet, that is also not wholly predictable. So maybe you're out there looking for a certain kind of rare lightning, and you can't tell exactly where and when it's going to happen. And then when it does, you're maybe not pointing the camera in the right direction, right? That's sort of what it's like. Or like Jane Goodall is out to document chimpanzees. What if the chimpanzees were invisible? You know, like that. That's sort of like the problematic situation that Andy talks about. When you go out there, the stuff that you're expecting isn't going to happen, and the evidence that you find is going to be the stuff that you did not expect. And so he sort of like grappled with that. But he would also say, you know, he developed some good protocols. He solved to his satisfaction the question of whether or not spirit orbs are correct. You know, he had a sort of like fundamental understanding of how various pieces of equipment worked and what was useful and not useful about them. But you're right. Ultimately, he failed to sort of like produce this watershed moment in science, or at least he has failed to date. He's still out there, and he's burnishing his scientific credentials as we speak. And he is still searching, I suppose you would say. And the fact that he hasn't come up with the smoking gun yet isn't necessarily all that discouraging to him. And some of the researchers that I spoke with, some of the scientists, the academic scientists, the anthropologists that I spoke with, they said that the quest is more about preserving uncertainty than finding an answer.
Right.
That if you it's far more um desirable to say, I'm just not so convinced that that is evidence, or I'm not so convinced that I'm not going to say that that's definitely not evidence. That being in that sort of middle zone is a self-perpetuating and satisfying path to take, because
Right.
it sort of like allows you to mediate the differences without having to confront any hard truths.
Wait, Al, can I just say this one thing? So, and then what was so striking about this particular part of the story, because I also want to connect it back to Val, which I mentioned in the beginning. So, what's so funny is that how this is on the one hand scientific, yet they can't even do the most basic thing like defining terms. So, like where she struggled with the soul in her lecture, I mean, for me, that was it's interesting that it was kind of presented that she's not a good lecturer or whatnot. But the interesting thing is nobody can really present on the soul. Like, what the fuck is that? So you have like these goalposts that continuously get moved and sort of maneuvered and changed. Like you had this other experience with the predicting the dead body in the backyard, and that wasn't found. And then it was like this philosophical question of what is time even? Maybe this is all kind of like not, maybe it wasn't supposed to be then, maybe it was something in the past, or maybe it could be something in the future. So what I'm ultimately saying is these concepts that's supposedly supposed to be the foundations, and they're supposed to be simple. Like again, what is the soul? What is time? It seems like there's no, forget about consensus. It doesn't even seem like one person has a coherent definition of what these are. So my thinking is, if you can't even define these simple concepts of like, okay, we're going to find this in time. What is time? We're going to find existence of a soul. What is the soul? This all seems to be a dead end just right off the bat.
Yeah, well, imagine if you had that uh uh worldview, and somebody said, Leon, I'm going to give you $1 million, and I would like you to make your best effort to document these things.
Mm,
Uh, then I think you would probably say, okay, there's a lot of work here to do, but I'm going to roll up my sleeves and I'm going to make the best effort because I'm earning that $1 million, or
hmm
I'm going to uh, see what I can do. And I think that's sort of like the mindset that a lot of people go out there with. But you're right, it sort of breaks down because there is no consensus opinion. And it's that lack of consensus opinion that characterizes the paranormal beliefs, and keeps them sort of like ever fresh, ever shifting, ever attuned to the needs of the individual in the moment that the individual needs
Hmm.
them,
Yeah.
and yet are so fluid that they can just change at the drop of a hat. And that is a social force and a dynamic that uh, has a lot of power. Uh, You and I don't like it for obvious reasons, uh, but it is still something that we have to grapple with, as if there are institutions out there that would like to coexist with these beliefs, they got to do a better job. They got to put something on the table that will bring these people into the fold. Because if not, more defunding is going to happen. Every time you want to earn $1 to study the effects of cancer, you're going to have to fight for it, because the fact that you're trying to beat cancer isn't good enough. You have to also find space within your scientific laboratory, uh, for making people feel good, for getting people to buy in.
Mhm.
And that's uh, it's not an appealing thought. Again, it's a position I came to very reluctantly. It feels like defeat. It tastes bitter in our mouths. Um, well, I do think that there are ways that institutions can do it and get through to the other side.
I would say that, I mean, in science, that a bit of that does still, that does exist in the sense of like questions about, the let's say Big Bang, or what is consciousness, and um, topics like that. I mean, there is enough mystery there that provides arguably not as fantastical as, some other perspectives that you could take. But I mean, it does in a way give that never-ending stimulation that, this constant mystery that, let's say, the paranormal perspective offers. I just guess, yeah, you have to find a nicer spin on it to make it more attractive, I guess. But you could still keep in line, like there's a way to find a framing that still within the established, narrative, to, still make that either viral or still, it scratches that itch we were talking about before. I'm
Mm.
sure there's a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
and let me give you a belief and tell me what you think about it. So
Mm.
there is a pervasive belief held by some that our entire reality is sort of like an echo or a reflection of something that's happening on the other side.
Mm.
So everything we do is sort of like a mirror image of some interactions on that other side, and that's driving everything. So everything in our reality is not actually here. All of the movement and the motivation that sort of like underlies everything comes from the other side. So just on its face, does that sound plausible to you guys, or does that
Sounds
sound
very platonic.
ridiculous?
Sounds very platonic. Yeah. So what are we? Are we all just replicas of the forms?
I Yeah, I
Yeah,
don't know.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
you could probably find something to support that and make that make sense. I've heard of simulation theory too, for example. Like,
Yeah,
yeah.
well, yeah, and that's sort of like my reveal. Where I'm going with that is um, that to me sounds like a very paranormal belief because it's so sort of divorced from our common experience of reality.
Mm,
But in fact, I read about it in a New York Times article about a research paper released by some leading quantum physicists.
Mm.
mm,
They posit that everything that we are is sort of like being dictated by the interaction of, how like quarks are like two molecules of, or yeah, not molecules, but two I don't even know what to
like a
call them.
particle and a
Uh
wave, or
Two particles, right, right. They affect each other even when they're separated by time and
Sure.
distance.
Yeah.
And that a black hole has sucked sort of like one half of that duo into itself, and we're what's left on the other side.
Mm.
So
mhm,
so that so that relationship that's driving everything is still happening, but uh, you know, we're separated by the boundaries of a black hole, which are themselves murky and poorly understood,
mm,
and the people who do understand them sound like nuts to the rest of us.
mm,
So my point is just that that there is very fantastical beliefs in the scientific world. And I do think that science could sort of rediscover that awe and that sense of wonder that you talked about, Alan. But because uh, the scientific community, to again go back to the global warming thing, the climate change thing, scientific community sort of realized that they needed to sound more forceful when they spoke about climate change because their hedging and hemming and hawing sounded bad, and they were sort of losing the political argument for this
mhm,
issue that they cared deeply about. And I just feel like they need to um, think in those same terms of selling themselves to the public in all that they do, and that
yeah.
harnessing the human capacity for wonder and awe is a really important component of that. Neil deGrasse Tyson, he's a master of that. deGrasse, Carl Sagan, master of that,
Mm,
right? So we do have people who are out there, or who have been out there, who have been able to capture the public imagination. Um, we just need more of them, and we need to lean on them a little bit more.
mm.
All right. So, Matt, as we start to wrap up, I'm actually going to ask you probably what's going to be the most difficult question of the entire show right before we leave. So, okay. So, just, to be fair, I like my perspective of it is my perspective. So, I'm not necessarily, I'm 100% right about this. So, to kind of preface that, not to put too much pressure on you. Okay. In treatment, what I would often tell my patients when it comes to something like delusional thinking is this. I would say, look, so in terms of what delusions are, they're beliefs that fundamentally are not only rigid, but that have a significant emotional payoff, right? So for the most part, we believe the things that we believe because they do something for us emotionally. They help us manage fear. They help us feel more motivated. They make us feel more hopeful, etc. But ultimately, the understanding is why they're called "quote unquote" delusional is because they significantly affect us in harmful, extremely harmful ways. Meaning that when you look at the cost and benefit, the benefit is usually so it's outweighed by the cost. And so what I would tell my patients is that look, once you start and once you allow yourself to believe something that's, quote unquote delusional, and this is not meant to be a pejorative. So, but once you start to do that, and once you start to, let's say, kind of negate or relegate reason to, let's say, a lower kind of realm or a lower area of your life, what happens is it sort of becomes a slippery slope, right? So it's like if you're saying to yourself, well, okay, this thing that let's say if there's something called like romantic delusion. I'm just throwing it out as an example. So let's say if you continue to believe that this person is romantically interested in you when obvious signs indicate that they're not, several things can happen, all of which are probably harmful to you and maybe even to that person, right? So my point is often to say that like once you start allowing yourself and allowing your mind to give space to these sort of beliefs, right? As a Richard Dawkins would have said, don't allow your brain to be or your mind to be so open that your brain falls out. So I would often tell my patients, you have to be really careful. You have to be really careful with those kind of beliefs, because what happens is if you allow one in, you allow two and three in, fundamentally it can easily become a slippery slope, right? So now we are trying to form some sort of harmonic union with people who do have more or less delusional type thinking, right? So is there a part of you that does fear if we allow these sort of beliefs, perspectives, or whatever, if we allow them into the space, that it does or can become a slippery slope for maybe sort of, for those people too, obviously, but for even the people outside of that sphere, meaning people who are kind of more on the fence, meaning even honestly some of the scientific type thinking or thinkers out there. So is there a part of you that feels like maybe allowing these sort of beliefs can be more harmful and more detrimental than helpful?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's the premise of the question is that we can allow those beliefs, right? But they don't need our permission. They're out there, right?
That's true.
So I definitely, a part of me is definitely sort of like, oh my goodness, am I really out there saying that institutions need to do a sort of half embrace of some of these beliefs? But there are so many examples that I found that show that this is a practical consideration. And we don't want witches to be sort of like forecasting our weather, right? We want to stay away from that. But I will tell you that in refugee camps that host African refugees run by the United Nations, witchcraft is a crime.
Wow.
And why is witchcraft a crime? Is it because the United Nations thinks that witchcraft is real? No, it's because it is a practical consideration. It's because if you don't recognize witchcraft as a crime, then mob justice will and vigilante justice will be the prevailing way to deal with witchcraft in these refugee camps, right? If you have a medical system that doesn't or that shits on the idea that someone's been abducted by an alien, then a person who is suffering trauma will not go to see their scientists or there's evidence-backed practitioner. They're just not going to do it, because why would you go in there to be told you're crazy and be given the good drugs? So yes, there is some downside to it. I think I think that definitely like it's not a 100% great to do this, but I just think that sort of like we've been debunking, we've been dismissing, we've been sneering and built a culture of zero tolerance for these sorts of beliefs, and it's gotten us nowhere. It's gotten us in the minority, right? So I think that as a practical consideration, if your real goal is to promote scientific understanding of the world, you will recognize that needs support from the public in the form of research dollars. And you will do things to loosen up those research dollars. And it doesn't mean that science has to become impure. It means that you have to develop, in the medical setting that I mentioned, protocols to understand and deal with some of these paranormal beliefs on their own terms. I talk about the belief of genies, right? Being possessed by jinn in the Muslim world. And medical practitioners in the Muslim world often have a protocol in place for this very common belief that a person's been possessed by a jinn. And the expression of that possession is, what we in the West would call various sorts of mental conditions. Hearing voices, or depression, or anxiety, or all sorts of different things. And so the medical professional in the Muslim world will deal with that like a sensitive religious cultural belief, and they will have a holy man come in and write some powerful words from the Quran on a piece of paper and dissolve that paper in some water and have the afflicted drink it as part of a broader therapeutic program. And so you're not sort of like throwing that person to the wolves of supernatural thinking,
Mhm.
but you are sort of like honoring their belief, and you're investing some research and some buy-in to show them that you take that belief seriously. But you're also sort of Trojan horsing in the actual corrective
Mm.
measures, which is one,
Interesting.
making that person feel good about their beliefs and feeling calm about their beliefs, and two, sort of like recognize evidence-based treatments like having more social connections and sort of like revisiting your medical practitioner on a regular basis to talk to that jinn a little bit more, and also incidentally to talk to the patient a little bit more and to keep
Mm.
them on track. uh, and similarly, I think that the government should license psychics and mediums and ghost hunters, because when they do that, they can mitigate some of the harm that those professions can do, and they can sort of harness the value that they can provide in terms of providing comfort to people who have been recently bereaved, um, but also being trained, requiring that they be trained to recognize when a person ought to be referred to a medical professional.
Mhm.
Um, and the sort of like incidental value of that is that then you have a class of ghost hunters. And there's like 80,000 psychic mediums practicing in the United States. Let's make them stakeholders, right?
Mm.
Let's give them an ability to do what they do and make money while doing it. We have all sorts of professions that do sort of like bad things that we're perfectly comfortable with. Let's bring these other people into the fold so that they too have a stake in government and a stake in a shared reality.
Hmm.
That's it. I'm going to change my dating profile to read open to dating somebody who believes in ghosts.
Perfect.
All right. So,
Yeah.
as I think that's a great point. So, Matt, just FYI, man, in my opinion, that's actually a really great point, and I will certainly take it seriously. Okay. So, as we wrap up, final questions for Matt.
Yes. If we wanted to follow you, follow your work, and of course buy the book, where can we do that?
Oh, thank you so much for asking. You can find me at matthongoltz-Hetling.com. I don't have a huge social media presence, but you can find me on go to my link tree, and you'll see I'm on Twitter and Blue Sky and Facebook, and all the regular stuff, sort of like building that up at the moment. The book is The Ghost Lab. Uh, you can find it at Amazon. You can find it at your independent bookstore. You can find it at Indie Books, Barnes and Noble. And If you are in New England, please come by and see me at an appearance at a local bookstore or library or other speaking venue. And I would be absolutely delighted to hear about your own ghostly experiences and your thoughts on what our place in the universe actually is.
I love it,
Awesome.
Matt. Thank you so much for coming on, and
Yeah, that's cool.
I'll reiterate the point that I made last time. You are legitimately one of my favorite writers, man.
Thank you very, very much. I love talking to you guys. Alan's so gentle. You guys are such a great counterpoint to each other. Uh, Alan is the sort of like the Ernie, the Sesame
He's
Street
the bird. I'm
Ernie.
the Ernie. Okay.
No, actually, he's the good version of Ben Shapiro.
Oh, that's a good compliment.
Okay.
Wow, that's a very
So,
good
so,
compliment.
so it's like the inverse Ben Shapiro with the sort of like rapid fire speaking and very very clear articulate thoughts coming out and sort of sharp arguments. Uh, and Al, you're the quiet deep thinker. So
Mm.
it's Ben Shapiro. It's Bizarro Ben Shapiro and
Oh, I'm Ben
Kramer
Shapiro.
and-
Oh, Ben Shapiro
You're-
and Alan
yeah,
is the
yeah,
DP.
yeah.
Oh gosh, I
That's
got you.
right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
I love it.
I love talking to you guys. So impressed by the work you do, and hope you keep it up.
Absolutely, Matt.
Thanks.
We'll talk to you soon, man. Thank you again. This was excellent.
Take care. All right, that was awesome. All right, so everyone, as you know, you can always follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On X, we're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe, hit the bell on YouTube. And again, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.